Gorkha Earthquake, Nepal, 2015. On April 25th at 11:26 in Kathmandu, Nepal, an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.8 struck. The initial shock lasted 50 seconds. This earthquake was caused by a break in the Earth's crust or thrusting fault in the Indus Yarlung suture zone. A fault is a fracture in the Earth's crust where tension causes movement of the rocks on the opposite sides of the fault, creating the 2015 Nepal earthquake. The earthquake affected central and eastern Nepal, northern India, and southern Tibet. The earthquake was caused by a sudden release of buildup stress along the main Himalayan thrust fault. This fault is part of the convergent boundary where the Indian plate is subducting beneath the Eurasian plate. This tectonic activity is part of the ongoing process that adds more than 0.4 inch to the height of the Himalayan mountains every year.
Human impact. Approximately 9,000 people died in Nepal and neighboring countries, and nearly 22,000 people were injured. At least 19 people were killed in an avalanche at Mount Everest Base Camp, which was triggered by the earthquake. Over 8 million people were affected by the earthquake, 3 million people were made homeless, and approximately 2.8 million people were displaced. Over 600,000 structures in Kathmandu and nearby towns were damaged or destroyed, and 7,000 schools were destroyed. Centuries-old buildings and UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Kathmandu Valley were destroyed, including parts of Changu Narayan Temple and the entire Dharahara Tower. Electricity, water supplies, and communications were severely disrupted. Economic impacts. Economic losses were estimated between 9 to 50% of Nepal's GDP, and the total cost of damages were estimated to be at $5 to $10 billion. 50% of shops were destroyed, affecting food supplies and livelihoods. Tourism, a major source of revenue, declined sharply. Hospitals were overwhelmed with injured patients, and 1.4 million people needed immediate support for food, water, and shelter. Landslides and avalanches triggered by the earthquake hampered relief efforts, and the risk of disease outbreaks increased due to lack of sanitation and clean water. While there were no reports of major famine or political unrest, the earthquake had a severe and long-lasting impacts on Nepal's people, economy, and development. The country required significant international aid and faced years of reconstruction efforts.
Environmental impacts. Landscape changes and natural disasters. Landslides and rockfalls were widespread, particularly in mountainous areas. At least 18 fissures and 13 landslides were observed on the popular pilgrimage trail from Dunche to Rosagandu. The Kalai Ganaki River was blocked by a landslide, leading to evacuations due to increased flooding risk. Avalanches on Mount Everest killed at least 19 people and affected the mountain's topography. Wildlife and ecosystem effects. Here are some effects on their habitat. There was loss and damage to wildlife habitat due to landslides, restricted wildlife movement in some areas. Potential impacts on breeding of endangered species as the earthquake occurred during the breeding season for animals like snow leopards, red pandas, and Himalayan musk deer. Like adverse effects on bird breeding, especially for cliff nesting species. Disruption of water sources affecting species with small home ranges. Earth systems. Some Earth systems that were affected by this earthquake are the geosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, and the atmosphere. The earthquake affected the geosphere by creating landslides. The earthquake affected water sources and drying up new sources that were emerging. That is how it affected the hydrosphere. The biosphere was affected by the wildlife, vegetation, and ecosystems being impacted negatively. The atmosphere, while not directly being affected, the atmosphere interacts with the other systems in long-term recovery processes.
Lessons learned and future preparing. Schools that had been retrofitted against seismic shocks performed much better than those that were not. Out of 160 retrofitted schools in the most affected districts, 125 reported no damage and 35 had only minor cracks. None of the retrofitted schools collapsed or needed major repairs. This success highlighted the importance of seismic retrofitting for existing buildings, especially critical infrastructure like schools. The earthquake underscored the need for community involvement at all stages of disaster response and preparedness. There was increased recognition of the importance of including rehabilitation services early in emergency response efforts. Evidence suggested that earlier inclusion of rehabilitation in disaster settings can lead to better outcomes, including fewer complications and improved functional outcomes for survivors. The disaster response highlighted the need to develop local leadership in disaster management. This suggests a shift towards empowering local communities in disaster preparedness and response. The earthquake raised awareness about the importance of earthquake security in Nepal, building on earlier initiatives like the School Earthquake Safety Program in 1997.
Here are some interesting facts. The Himalayan region is one of the most seismically active in the world, but large earthquakes occur infrequently. Before 2015, the last major earthquake having a magnitude of 6.0 or above was in 1988. The initial shock had a moment magnitude of 7.8, with its epicenter about 48 miles northwest of Kathmandu. Thank you very much.
Thank you.